Welcome to the video, guys. We're taking another look at something that was on the BBC. This time, it was on BBC Radio 4 yesterday, featuring the host talking with Lord Sumption about the current coronavirus lockdown, its effect on lowering the death rate, our civil liberties, and of course the police's enforcement of the government guidelines, since he was a Supreme Court judge. During the interview, he completely destroys the narrative around the lockdown that the media are pumping out there, saying the lockdown will prevent deaths, which, according to Lord Sumption, is flat wrong and is something I have seen in other studies elsewhere over the last couple of weeks. As usual though, the BBC host is trying his best to push his agenda, constantly trying to interrupt Lord Sumption with baseless claims about South Korea, immunity, and a multitude of other things. So let's take a look at it and we'll go over some of the things he has to say, along with the host's completely unbiased performance.
The virus is far less dangerous to most young people. The whole population lockdown is way too much, and it's a view held by some inside Whitehall and outside. Among the critics has been Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, former Justice of the Supreme Court, and I'm happy to say he joins us. I just wonder where you are on where the government is.
Well, I'm exactly where I was before, because the mountain has groaned and put forth a mouse. Hardly anything is being changed. And that seems to me to be the main criticism to be made of the Prime Minister's statement. But there is, I think, an important thing to notice about it, which is that the narrative has changed in quite a significant way. The fact is, a lockdown doesn't reduce deaths. What it does is to push infections and the resulting deaths into the future. And that's because viral diseases are not like a hurricane which just blows over and we can all come out in the sun again. And the government's paper that published today does recognise this. It says the virus is going to be with us for a long time.
Well, actually, you're not quite right there, are you? Far be it from me to argue with a former Supreme Court justice. You can suppress the virus down to a level and then test, trace and isolate individual cases if you get it to a low enough level, and then you can suppress and go about normal life like South Korea is. And I think that is the objective.
You can only do that if you have either a vaccine or a sufficient degree of collective immunity.
No, but South Korea has neither of those things, and South Korea's economy is widely open, and it's not in that position, is it?
The government itself has recognised that viruses do not go away. And we're going to have to live with this virus for a long time.
South Korea recognises that, but has none of the problems.
You'll find it on page 12 of their statement.
But you get small outbreaks and you try and suppress them as quickly as you can. You don't have to say everybody's going to get it. And we may well have a vaccine within a couple of years anyway. So you're talking about...
Well, we can't be locked down for 2 years.
No, but South Korea isn't locked down. I keep coming back to the point. There are countries who've shown how you can do this. If you can temporarily suppress to a level where you can then isolate individual cases, you can go about a relatively normal life for 2 years without a lockdown.
You can certainly do that, or you can do what Sweden is doing, which is not to bother with a lockdown at all, and their results are not significantly different from ours. I mean, the fact is that according to the Office of National Statistics, 91% of the deaths have been with people with serious underlying conditions. 88% have been of people over 65. The number of deaths of people under 50 is so tiny that the Office of National Statistics isn't even able to show it on their colourful charts. Yet it is people who are fit and under 65 who are being asked to sacrifice not just their liberty, but their jobs, their businesses, and all the ordinary collective activities that make life worth living for something that hardly affects them at all.
So Lord Sumption wastes no time in pointing out that Prime Minister's briefing was overblown by the media, which is obviously a common theme with them during this situation. And we see it in this clip here from the BBC shitweasel, who is constantly trying to prove Lord Sumption wrong with claims about South Korea, which the BBC host even goes as far as to claim that they do not have immunity. I would love to know personally how he knows whether or not South Korea has any level of immunity to this current virus. because he cites them enough that he must be an expert on the situation in South Korea right now. You can literally tell the BBC host's agenda is to keep the lockdown in place for as long as possible. Maybe that is because they are getting record viewing figures during the pandemic, so it does give them a reason to extend the lockdown, keep everyone indoors, listening to the constant fear-mongering on TV. Lord Sumption obviously is not buying that and points out that lockdowns are supposed to be to allow the NHS to get capacity, which he points out it has plenty of now, meaning the lockdown could be taken off because the capacity is increased, allowing the government and the National Health Service to be able to deal with the situation, which, if you remember back to before the lockdown, was actually their plan for why the lockdown was needed, to give them a little bit of time so they could increase ICU bed capacity, which they have done and has remained largely unused. Now, the BBC host is determined to say that you can keep the lockdown, isolate cases, and go back to some level of normal, I'm guessing in a few months or so, as that would suit them likely the best. Keep everyone locked inside, like I said, to watch their crap on TV. But you will notice he shows absolutely no interest when he brings up Sweden, who have done no lockdown whatsoever and actually have much better death statistics than us per 100,000 of their population. Because if that metric is used, which is the metric that should really be used, it finds us well below the likes of Belgium, Spain and Italy, and still sitting above Sweden even with the lockdown. The best part of that clip, though, has to be the end, where Lord Sumption destroys the BBC shitweasel's argument by stating the ONS, or Office of National Statistics, figures that suggest the media have completely blown this all out of proportion and brought the government along for the ride, or they've allowed them to do it for some reason, it would appear. Lord Sumption is stating the figures there that suggest this has been blown out of all proportion. Because when all is said and done at the end of the day, it might turn out that the lockdown was actually more damaging to the country and to the health of its citizens than not doing one at all. Time will tell, obviously. Let's move on to the next clip, though.
So let's be clear about your approach. It is essentially to say, someone like yourself, you're 70 plus.
Yes.
You will make your own choice about how much risk of exposure you want to take, and you will decide whether you lock down. But the rest of us will make our own choice, and most young people would be advised just get on with things.
Exactly. I doubt whether it was ever justifiable to deprive people of their liberty because the government had failed properly to prepare for a pandemic. But the only respectable argument there's ever been for a lockdown was that pushing infections into the future was a strictly temporary measure to allow time for the NHS's intensive care capacity to catch up. Now, it's obvious that the NHS capacity has caught up. That's partly because the government has done a very good job in increasing ICU capacity, and partly because the threat was always grossly overstated. We have two huge temporary Nightingale hospitals lying empty. We have at the moment a large unused ICU capacity. And that's why we heard nothing last night from the PM about saving the NHS, and the phrase has been dropped from their slogan. So this lockdown is no longer about saving the NHS, it's about shielding us from the risk of infection. And frankly, we can all make our own decisions about that.
I think it's about getting it to such a low level that we can then more or less live with it suppressed without any lockdown for anybody.
That is not a good enough justification for a qualified house imprisonment applicable in principle to the whole population. It really is not. This is the worst interference with personal liberty in our history. For what is, by historical standards, not a very serious pandemic, except for particular categories of vulnerable people who can isolate themselves voluntarily.
That position is you're not alone in holding that position.
I am not.
So you hear him point out there what many people have been saying, and obviously they have done in Sweden, which is to not lock down, let people go about their business, shield the ones who need to be shielded, and obviously, like Boris said yesterday, use a little bit of common sense. You have to remember, Lord Sumption is in one of these categories of so-called high risk, and himself is saying that people should be able to make the decisions they want to make and take steps to mitigate their own risk as they see fit, which is back to the common sense way of dealing with it. especially now, as he said, that the ICU capacity is well above what was needed and should see us through perfectly fine, which I think the government is also aware of, but might be too worried about media reaction if they just end the lockdown as it is. Because I'm sure if Lord Sumption is aware of this, then so are the people within the government. Some of it might be saving face, some of it might be something completely different. I haven't got a clue. Now, you heard him mention the government dropping the Save the NHS line. I made a remark to the missus about it last night, how they was no longer talking so much about saving the NHS, because obviously that has already been done with the draconian lockdown that has likely gone on for far too long already, which Lord Sumption thinks should come instantly, trusting the British citizens to use their common sense. And obviously, the ones who lack common sense can sit there and piss and whine about it on Twitter while they stay in their home. No one is forcing them to leave. Once again though, the BBC host tries to intervene with some nonsense, insinuating that the lockdown should be extended, which Lord Sumption quickly shits on with the basic fact that it is not good enough a reason to take away people's civil liberties, which I'm sure many, if not all of you would agree with. As he said, when we look back on this, in comparison to other historical pandemics, it will be small potatoes, especially if they find out that most of the population had the virus and was asymptomatic, which there are studies to suggest is already likely, but we don't know for sure. But let's move on and see what he had to say about the police and the new guidelines, because obviously we know the police have been going on a bit of a mad one during this coronavirus lockdown.
I do want to get some of your legal advice now. Now I know that you're just the government don't start from here, just scrap the lockdown, and that's all you need to do. What would be your advice to the police on enforcement of the new guidelines? Do you think it is practicable to distinguish between, if you like, reasonable adherence to the rules in a reasonable way that might involve sitting with two people at a park, 2 meters apart, or 4 people sitting in the park? I just wonder whether you think the law can apply to the rather complicated advice that's been given as we come out of the hardest lockdown.
The problem about using law as your instrument is that law requires definition, exact definition, and it works in categories. So if you do this not voluntarily but compulsorily, you are bound to have laws which make perfect sense in some contexts and not in others. The problem about law is that it excludes common sense. Now, the Prime Minister has said in the House of Commons this afternoon that he trusts the British to use their common sense. But you can't say to a policeman, you must arrest somebody or fine them if he is using common sense and not otherwise. The whole legal approach invites a collection of completely arbitrary rules unrelated to the underlying purpose of the regulations. And you couldn't have a more perfect illustration of that than the incredibly complex, utterly arbitrary distinctions contained in the government's document this afternoon, distinguishing between meeting one person and meeting 2 people, between meeting one person in your back garden and meeting one person in the street outside your front garden. I mean, these are illustrations of the kind of ridiculous distinctions that you get when, instead of resorting to common sense, you resort to law.
So you would rather it was all common sense and no law than an attempt to sort of meld the two?
I would, because I have every confidence that our sense of preservation and our common sense will enable us to get through this without the nanny state telling us at every point what we can and what we can't do, especially when so much of what they are saying actually makes no sense at all.
Lord Sumption, interesting to hear you. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I would suggest that former Supreme Court judge is literally shitting on the government's attempts to make us going outside and meeting up with more than one person illegal. Because not only is it impossible to police, as I'm sure most of you are already aware, it lacks common sense and is completely ridiculous. I would have to say I'm inclined to agree with Lord Sumption on this, simply because he is a judge after all, and should at least have some grasp on what the law can and cannot do. To be honest, given the figures I have seen from the ONS and multiple other studies that are suggesting social distancing was enough, if the government will not release the lockdown completely, then we should at least be able to make our own decisions around seeing family members and meeting up with friends, while of course observing some social distancing, as we've heard from Lord Sumption during the clips that I've shown. The BBC host was as disingenuous as ever, but that shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone. It seems to me that the media want this lockdown to continue, possibly for years and years. They must be loving the viewing figures that they are getting now on the news broadcasts, and I expect TV shows in general. But on that note, guys, I am going to end the video there. Now, before I go, I've started doing live streams and uploading gaming content on my second channel. If you would like to come and join me for a live stream to chat in real time, have an interest in gaming related content on YouTube, or just want to follow me over there because you are a legend, the link will be down in the video description below and as a pinned comment. I hope to see you all there. Now, as always, before I go, I want to thank our PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar and YouTube members for supporting the channel, along with everyone who watches my videos. Remember to let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Leave a like, subscribe with the notification bell and share this video as it helps the channel a lot. And I will see you all in the next one.
There is a pattern consistent throughout history of oppressed people turning on the oppressors. Slaves against their owners, the peasantry against the feudal barons, colonies, Mr. Verhofstadt, against their empires. And that is why Britain is leaving. And it doesn't matter which language you use, we are going, and we are glad to be going. We're off.